Senator Sheldon Whitehouse didn't just challenge Pam Bondi, he exposed a crisis. The people sworn to protect the truth are now the ones twisting it, and that's how honesty dies in government.
Here's the second thing, and this goes back to the ranking member's comments about yesterday. To me, yesterday was an awful day in the history of this committee. It set new low after new low after new low. And I'm not going to talk about all of the new lows. I'm going to talk about one in particular. And that is whether anybody noticed the irony that the day before the United States Department of Justice arraigned a former FBI director for allegedly making untruthful statements to this committee, the Attorney General of the United States sat right there and made untruthful statements to this committee. And they weren't maybe untruthful statements. This wasn't a question of nuance. She made allegations about the ranking member and me having received political contributions from some, she said, Epstein close confidant. Well, guess what? That's actually checkable. There's a thing called the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission keeps a website that tracks all of our contributions. An intern at the Department of Justice could have checked to see that the allegation, I'll leave it to myself, that I had received campaign contributions from this individual, that was false. And it's not a maybe answer, it's a yes or no. Did I or didn't I? And there's an unimpeachable record that shows that what she said sitting right there was not true. If we are going to care about untruthful statements made by the Department of Justice and the FBI in this committee, let's not have this be yet another area where there are different rules for one party than for the other party. And just by the way, on that very subject, the other thing that the Attorney General did sitting right there was to strip all cover away from the untruthful statements that had been made to this committee by the current FBI director. You all heard him here. He said that he couldn't tell us about his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case, where he first pled the Fifth, then got immunity, and then testified. He couldn't tell us what he testified to, he said, because the Department of Justice had sealed the testimony, and because there was a court order barring him from doing that. And he actually identified which judge, the chief judge of the DC Federal District Court. Well, guess what? We know that since then, the chief judge of the Federal District Court has said that that was not true. He said specifically nothing prevented Director Patel from discussing his grand jury testimony. And yesterday, the Attorney General had the chance to say, you're right. We did seal the testimony in that matter. The Department of Justice did seal the testimony, and Patel's statement was true. Not about the court order, but at least it was sealed by the Department of Justice. She didn't say that. So now both his testimony that the DOJ had sealed his testimony and his testimony there was a court order barring his testimony are kind of demonstrably false statements to this committee. And then when he came back and we challenged him on those false statements, his second false statement was to say, I'm not going to answer any of those questions because my transcript of the grand jury testimony, I've worked with the DOJ to see that it is publicly released. Well, it either has been publicly released or it hasn't. It's a very simple distinction, yes or no. And we all know that it has not, in fact, been publicly released. And when we asked about that from the Attorney General, again, she left him high and dry and refused to say that anything had been publicly released, that there was any publicly released transcript. So yesterday stands in really stark contrast, I should say the day before yesterday stands in really stark contrast to yesterday. Yesterday, an FBI director was arraigned for making a false statement. The day before that, the Attorney General of the United States made arguably even falser statements. We'll see how the other case turns out. And she left the current FBI director completely exposed on his multiple false statements that his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case had been sealed by the department, was under court order not to be released, and had since been publicly released as a transcript. I don't know if this committee is going to take itself seriously enough to treat false statements to this committee as serious matters, irrespective of who made them. But the contrast is really stark. Thank you, Chairman.
There are moments in politics that sound less like oversight and more like reckoning. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's remarks were one of those moments. A blistering moral confrontation with something most Americans feel but rarely see spoken out loud. The idea that truth itself has become partisan property. When Whitehouse called the Attorney General's testimony an awful day in the history of this committee, it wasn't hyperbole. It was heartbreak. Because beneath the procedural language and political sparring, he was describing something deeper. A government at war with its own integrity. Whitehouse laid out a chain of contradictions that should disturb anyone who still believes in equal justice under law. A former FBI director arraigned for false statements to Congress. And one day earlier, an attorney general allegedly offering misleading claims under oath. An FBI director claiming he couldn't discuss his own grand jury testimony because of sealed orders, only for a federal judge to later confirm that wasn't true. To most Americans, these details sound technical, maybe even tedious. But to anyone who understands how fragile democracy really is, this is the machinery of accountability grinding to a halt. Because when power starts treating the truth as a tool, something to wield or conceal depending on convenience, you no longer have oversight. You have performance. Whitehouse's outrage wasn't about party politics. It was about standards. He was saying that integrity should not depend on who's sitting in the witness chair or what letter follows their name on a ballot. That false statements are false statements whether they come from the left or the right, from an FBI agent or an attorney general. What made this speech so important wasn't just the accusation, it was the context. In 1 week, 2 of the country's highest legal officers found themselves entangled in conflicting accounts, sealed testimonies, and half-truths. That's not just bureaucratic chaos. That's a crisis of trust. When the public starts to believe that accountability only applies selectively, that it's one set of rules for the powerful and another for everyone else, democracy begins to rot from the inside. And Whitehouse's words, calm but cutting, carried the weight of that realization. He wasn't just speaking to the committee, he was speaking to history. Because every time Congress lets untruth slide, every time partisanship trumps principle, another piece of democratic legitimacy dies quietly in the background. This isn't about defending one administration or condemning another. It's about the standard that truth is not negotiable. If false statements under oath are a crime for one, they must be a crime for all. Otherwise, justice becomes theater. A stage where consequences are written only for the powerless. Whitehouse's remarks revealed something profound. That the true crisis in Washington isn't corruption or incompetence, it's cynicism. The quiet, creeping belief that integrity no longer matters. Because once truth becomes optional, everything else follows. Trust, law, democracy itself. So when Whitehouse called that day an awful day in the history of this committee, he wasn't just condemning a moment. He was warning of a trajectory, a slow slide toward a future where hearings mean nothing, oaths mean less, and power answers only to itself. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We, the public, play a role in this too. We've been conditioned to treat these hearings like episodes in a political drama. Villains, heroes, twists, and outrage. But this isn't entertainment. This is oversight. The last line of defense between government power and the people it serves. That's why moments like this matter, because they remind us that democracy doesn't die when politicians lie. It dies when citizens stop caring that they do. So what should we take from this? Not despair, but clarity. That transparency isn't a partisan demand. It's the oxygen of democracy. That truth doesn't belong to one side of the aisle. It belongs to the people. And that integrity, no matter how inconvenient, is still the measure of power worth trusting. If Senator Whitehouse's warning hit hard, it's because deep down we know he's right. Yesterday may have been an awful day for the committee, but it can still be a turning point for the country if we choose to remember that truth, even when uncomfortable, is what keeps democracy alive. Because once we stop demanding truth from power, we stop being citizens and start being spectators. So let's not watch this like a show. Let's learn from it. Let's demand honesty from every seat of power, left, right, or center. Because truth is not a luxury. It's the foundation of freedom. Subscribe Capital Debate Files. Thanks for watching.